The year is 1897. Deep in the Missouri Ozarks, a labyrinth of ancient hills and hollows, the autumn air grows teeth. It is a land that swallows secrets, a place where civilization is a flickering candle against an overwhelming darkness. For a lone traveler on the winding dirt path, a man named Silas Kane, the coming storm is not merely an inconvenience, it is a predator. Rain, cold and relentless, begins to soak his wool coat, turning the path to a slick, grasping mud. His horse is spooked, its eyes wide with an animal sense of unease that Silas is beginning to share. He is a peddler, his cart laden with threads, needles, and tinctures, small treasures for the isolated folk of these hills. But as dusk bleeds across the sky, turning the gnarled trees into skeletal silhouettes, he realizes he is miles from the nearest town. He is lost. That is when he sees it, a single point of light, warm and yellow, piercing the gloom, a cabin. Smoke curls from its stone chimney, a promise of warmth and shelter. Relief washes over him, so potent it almost scours away the creeping dread in his gut. He urges his weary horse forward, the cabin's light a lonely star in a sea of encroaching black. As he draws closer, he can make out the figure of a woman standing in the doorway, a lantern held aloft. She is a silhouette against the firelight within, still and watchful. He calls out, his voice hoarse against the rising wind, asking for shelter. The figure does not move for a long moment, then gives a slow, deliberate nod. The door opens wider. Silas, shivering and grateful, leads his horse toward the small barn and then hurries to the offered sanctuary. The woman, a widow by her black dress and severe hair, says nothing, merely gesturing him inside. The warmth of the hearth is a balm to his frozen bones. But as the heavy oak door swings shut behind him, the sound of the bolt sliding home is unnervingly final. The air inside is thick with the smell of wood smoke, yes, but something else too. Something sweet, savory, and deeply, fundamentally wrong. Silas Kane, the peddler with a cart full of small treasures, had just made his final transaction. He had traded his life for a moment's warmth, and no one would ever know. The Ozark Mountains in the late 19th century were a world unto themselves. Carved by time and water, these were not the soaring, majestic peaks of the West, but a tangled, claustrophobic maze of steep hills, dense forests, and hidden valleys known as hollows. It was a landscape that bred a unique kind of people, fiercely independent, deeply suspicious of outsiders, and bound by traditions and superstitions as old as the hills themselves. The Civil War had left deep scars here, pitting neighbor against neighbor, and fostering a culture of isolation and self-reliance that bordered on outright paranoia. Law was a distant concept, often administered at the end of a rope or the barrel of a gun. This was a place where people vanished. A man might set out for the next county to trade furs and simply never arrive. A prospector chasing rumors of lead or zinc could walk into a ravine and cease to be. The wilderness was an ever-present accomplice to disappearance, providing 1,000 plausible explanations. A misstep in the dark, a run-in with a panther, a sudden fever with no doctor for 50 miles. The land itself was the perfect cover for any crime. And so, when travelers began to disappear along the old trading route that cut through the rugged territory near Hemlock Hollow, few took official notice. These were solitary men, drifters, peddlers, and laborers following whispers of work, men with no families to raise an alarm, no roots to anchor their memory. They were ghosts even before they were gone, but patterns, like water, eventually wear down even the hardest stone. And one man, the town's reluctant constable, was beginning to see a pattern. The disappearances were all on the same stretch of road, all men traveling alone, and all within a few miles of a single, isolated property, a small farmstead owned by a reclusive widow named Elspeth Blackwood, a woman whose own history was a disturbing cold case, a macabre tale whispered only in hushed tones after the sun went down. Elspeth Blackwood was a specter in the landscape long before she became a suspect. She had arrived in Hemlock Hollow a decade earlier with her husband, Josiah, and their 2 young children. They were outsiders, having bought a tract of land that locals considered poor and ill-favored, a place where the soil was thin and the shadows lingered too long. The Blackwoods kept to themselves, a fact that was both common and damning in the Ozarks. To be private was to have secrets, and secrets bred suspicion. Josiah was a stoic, hardworking man who rarely came to town. Elspeth was seen even less, a fleeting shape in a dark dress, her face always obscured by a bonnet. Then, 5 years before our story begins, tragedy struck, or so it was said. Josiah and both children succumbed to a sudden, violent fever that swept through their cabin in less than a week. Elspeth somehow was spared. She came to town just once after the tragedy, her face a pale, emotionless mask, to purchase lumber for 3 coffins and file the deed in her name alone. No doctor had been summoned. No one from town saw the bodies. Elspeth had dug the graves herself, behind the cabin, marking them with simple, uncarved river stones. The official cause of death was recorded as consumption, a catch-all for the wasting illnesses that plagued the era. But the whispers in Hemlock Hollow told a different, more forbidden story. They spoke of the unnatural silence that fell over the Blackwood property. No laughter of children, no holler of a husband calling in his livestock. Only the constant, unsettling plume of smoke from Elspeth's chimney, a lonely signal in the vast wilderness. Some said she had poisoned them. Others whispered of a darker, preternatural pact, that she had traded her family to the ancient things that lived in the hills in exchange for what no one could say. The widow became a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale, a boogeyman in a black dress, and on her cursed land the ground seemed to be unnaturally fertile. Constable Jebediah Thorne was a man worn down by his past, a veteran of the Battle of Wilson's Creek. He had seen enough bloodshed to last a lifetime and had taken the job in Hemlock Hollow seeking peace. Instead, he found a different kind of war, a quiet, creeping struggle against the darkness that festered in isolation. He was not a detective in the modern sense. He was a keeper of a fragile order, a man who relied on intuition and an understanding of the local customs. The missing travelers were a thorn in his conscience. The first had been a year ago, a surveyor from Springfield, then a fur trapper 6 months later. Now, in the autumn of 1897, the disappearance of the peddler, Silas Kane, felt different. Kane was known, if not well liked. He made regular rounds and his absence was noted. When his horse and abandoned cart were found miles down the road, picked clean by scavengers both animal and human, Thorne knew he could no longer dismiss the disappearances as accidents of the wilderness. He sat in his small office, a map of the county spread on his desk. With a piece of charcoal, he marked the last known locations of the 3 men. The marks formed a tight, unnerving cluster, and right in the center of that cluster sat the Blackwood property. It was circumstantial, of course. The road was the only viable passage through that part of the mountains. Anyone traveling it would pass her land. But it was the rumors that gnawed at him, the whispers about the widow who never bought meat yet always had a fire going, the widow whose garden grew impossibly lush, producing blood-red tomatoes and unnaturally large squash in soil that should have yielded only rocks and weeds. Thorne was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or superstition. He didn't believe in curses or wood witches. But he did believe in the capacity for human darkness. He knew that isolation, like a pressure cooker, could warp a soul into something unrecognizable. He decided it was time to pay a visit to the widow. He would be polite, of course, just making inquiries. But as he saddled his horse, a cold knot formed in his stomach. He was heading into the heart of a local legend, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that some legends are born from horrifying truths. The path to the Blackwood cabin was less a road and more a scar on the land. Overgrown and claustrophobic, the branches of oak and hickory trees clawed at Thorne as he rode, as if trying to pull him from his saddle. The air grew still and heavy, the usual chorus of birdsong conspicuously absent. All he could hear was the plodding of his horse and the frantic beating of his own heart. When he finally broke through the trees into the clearing, the sight of the cabin was jarring. It was impeccably maintained. The log walls were chinked tight against the wind, the stone chimney was solid and well built, and the small porch was swept clean. But it was the garden that seized his attention. Just as the rumors claimed, it was an explosion of life in a clearing of otherwise dead-looking earth. Thick vines coiled around sturdy posts, and plump, dark vegetables pushed through the soil with an almost grotesque vitality. The colors were too vibrant, the growth too aggressive. It felt predatory. In the center of this unnatural bounty stood Elspeth Blackwood. She was tending to her plants, her back to him. She wore the same severe black dress he remembered, her hair pulled back in a tight, unforgiving bun. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was both elegant and deeply unsettling. Thorne cleared his throat, and the sound was like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. She didn't startle. She simply straightened up slowly and Arned to face him. Her face was pale and angular, dominated by eyes so dark they seemed to drink the light. They were ancient eyes filled with a knowledge that felt both profound and forbidden. There was no fear in them, no surprise, only a calm, unnerving watchfulness. "Constable," she said, her voice low and even, devoid of any regional accent. It was a voice that did not belong in these hills. "To what do I owe the honor?" Her politeness was a weapon, a perfectly smooth surface that offered no purchase for his questions, no crack through which to see the truth. Jebediah Thorne dismounted, trying to project an authority he did not feel. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began, his voice steady, "I'm making inquiries. Another traveler's gone missing on this road, a peddler, name of Silas Kane. You might have seen him pass by." He watched her face for any flicker of recognition, any hint of deception. There was nothing. Her expression remained a placid mask of polite indifference. "A peddler, you say?" she replied, her voice smooth as polished river stone. "I see so few people out here. The days bleed one into the next. I can't say that I recall." She gestured vaguely toward the oppressive wall of trees. "The woods are hungry, Constable. They take what they want." The statement hung in the air, simple and yet layered with a chilling ambiguity. Was it a folk saying, a warning, or a confession? Thorne pressed on. "His horse and cart were found down the way. It seems he just vanished." "A sad thing," she said, her gaze drifting to her unnaturally vibrant garden. "But men are careless creatures. A snakebite, a fall, a sudden storm. This land does not suffer fools." Her calmness was more unnerving than any lie or outburst would have been. It was the calm of a predator, certain in its own territory. Thorne's eyes scanned the property, searching for anything out of place. The axe near the woodpile was clean, its blade sharp. The smokehouse door was shut tight, a heavy padlock on its hasp. The windows of the cabin were dark and inscrutable. Everything was in its place, meticulously ordered. It was the kind of tidiness that felt less like good housekeeping and more like the systematic erasing of evidence. He felt a desperate need to see inside the cabin, to break through this woman's impenetrable composure. But he had no warrant, no proof, only a cluster of marks on a map and a stomach full of dread. As if reading his mind, Elspeth offered a thin, bloodless smile. "Would you care for a glass of water, Constable? The ride is long and the autumn sun can be deceiving." It was an invitation, but it felt like a trap. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to turn his horse around and ride away. But he was the law, and the law could not show fear. "I would appreciate that, ma'am," he said, the words feeling like a betrayal of his own survival instincts. He had to see inside. He had to know what secrets were kept behind that heavy oak door. Stepping across the threshold of Elspeth Blackwood's cabin was like stepping into another time. The air inside was cool and still, thick with the scent he'd noticed before during the storm, from the tail of Silas Kane, wood smoke and cooking meat, but with a strange, cloying sweetness underneath. The interior was a single, large room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace where a low fire crackled. Like the outside, the inside was obsessively clean. The floorboards were scrubbed pale, the sparse furniture was polished to a dull sheen, and a simple cot in the corner was made with military precision. But Thorne's eyes were not on the tidiness. They were drawn to the details. On a rough-hewn mantel above the fireplace sat a collection of small objects, arranged in a neat, deliberate row. A tarnished silver button, the kind found on a gentleman's waistcoat. A small, intricately carved bone needle case. A brass compass, its glass cracked. And a simple, well-worn pocket knife. They were trinkets, mementos, the kind of personal effects a man might carry. They did not belong to a woman who lived alone. Elspeth followed his gaze. Keepsakes, she said, her voice betraying no emotion. From a lifelong past. Whose life? Thorne wanted to ask, but the question caught in his throat. He saw no portraits, no evidence of the husband and children who had supposedly died here. It was as if they had been erased, replaced by these small, anonymous relics of other men. She handed him a tin cup of water from a bucket by the door. The water was cold and clean, but he could barely bring himself to drink it. His mind was racing, trying to connect the disturbing pieces. The missing men, the unnerving calm of the widow, the garden that grew with unnatural vigor, and now these trophies displayed in plain sight. It was a horrifying, macabre puzzle, and he felt he was only seeing the edges of it. He thanked her for the water, his voice sounding hollow in the quiet room. As he turned to leave, his eyes fell upon a heavy trap, or set into the floor near the hearth, fitted with a thick iron ring. A root cellar, most likely, common in these parts, but the wood around it was darker, stained by something that had been scrubbed away, but not completely. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of ice through his veins. What was she keeping in the dark? Jebediah Thorne rode away from the Blackwood property with a profound sense of failure and a far deeper sense of dread. He had found no concrete evidence, nothing that would allow him to get a warrant, nothing to justify a formal accusation. He had only a collection of deeply unsettling impressions and a growing certainty that he had just shared a room with a monster. His visit had been a test, and he felt he had failed it. He had let Elspeth Blackwood control the encounter, her unnerving calm a shield he could not penetrate. Back in Hemlock Hollow, he found himself isolated with his suspicions. When he cautiously broached the subject with the town's mayor and the local preacher, he was met with dismissal. Elspeth was a grieving widow, a tragic figure. The missing men were drifters, unreliable by nature. It was a tragedy of the wilderness, not a crime. To accuse a bereaved woman based on local gossip and a constable's bad feeling was unchristian and would only stir up trouble. Thorne was being told in no uncertain terms to let it go, but he couldn't. The image of the trophies on the mantel was burned into his mind. The strange, sweet smell from her chimney haunted his sleep. He began his own quiet, obsessive investigation. He rode to the county seat, a full day's journey to search the archives. He looked for the deed to the Blackwood property, hoping to find a clue in their origins. He found that they had come from the east, from a region in the Appalachians known for its particularly insular and strange folk traditions. He looked for the official record of the deaths of her husband and children. He found the simple filing, signed by a justice of the peace, listing consumption as the cause. No doctor's signature, no coroner's report. It was a paper-thin story, perfectly legal, yet utterly unconvincing. He felt like he was hunting a phantom, a creature that knew how to use the gaps in the system, the indifference of the world as its camouflage. The law was a tool for a civilized world, and Thorne was beginning to fear that Elspeth Blackwood did not belong to that world at all. She operated by a different, much older set of rules. As winter began to lay its cold, heavy hand on the Ozarks, the case grew colder. The early snows blanketed the hills, erasing paths and hiding any secrets the forest might hold. With travel nearly impossible, the disappearances stopped. A tense, unnatural quiet settled over Hemlock Hollow, and the memory of the missing peddler began to fade, buried under the more immediate concerns of survival. For a time, Thorne almost allowed himself to believe he had been wrong. Perhaps the strain of his office, the isolation of his life, had made him paranoid. Perhaps Elspeth Blackwood was exactly what she seemed, a lonely widow, haunted by tragedy, living a solitary life. But the doubt never truly took root. It was a fragile thing, easily shattered. The shattering came during a particularly brutal cold snap in late January. A young trapper named Billy Croft, barely 18, had set his lines in the hills, pushing further into the wilderness than was wise, desperate for a good haul of pelts. A blizzard swept in without warning, a blinding wall of white. Billy never returned to his family's cabin. A search party was formed, a grim procession of grim-faced men led by Constable Thorne. For 2 days they scoured the frozen landscape, their calls swallowed by the snow-laden pines. On the third day they found him, or what was left of him. He was in a shallow ravine not far from the edge of the Blackwood property. The official story would be that he froze to death, caught in the storm. But Thorne saw things the others overlooked or chose not to see. Billy's pack was missing. His rifle was gone. And despite the presence of wolves in these hills, his body was strangely untouched by animal predators. Most disturbing of all, there were footprints in the snow leading away from the body. Not the heavy boot prints of a man, but a smaller, lighter track, methodical and unhurried. Tracks that led directly toward the unnerving, ever-present plume of smoke rising from Elspeth Blackwood's chimney. The horrifying realization struck Thorne with the force of a physical blow. The hunting season had not ended. The predator had simply been waiting for new prey. The death of Billy Croft was a turning point. He was not a nameless drifter. He was a local boy, known and mourned by the community. His death, even officially ruled an accident, reawakened the dormant fear and suspicion surrounding the widow of Hemlock Hollow. The whispers started again, this time with a more urgent, venomous edge. P. Opal in the general store fell silent when Elspeth made her rare trip for supplies like flour and salt. Mothers pulled their children closer when her wagon passed. The folklore that had once been a kind of morbid entertainment now felt like a terrifyingly real warning. The stories grew darker, more elaborate. Some claimed to have seen strange lights moving in the woods around her cabin on moonless nights. Others spoke of hearing faint, rhythmic chanting carried on the wind, a sound that made the hair on their arms stand up. The most macabre rumor was that the animals in the woods, the deer, the rabbits, the squirrels, instinctively avoided the Blackwood property, creating a dead zone, a circle of unnatural silence and stillness for a mile in every direction around her cabin. These tales, born of fear and isolation, began to paint a portrait of a woman who was not merely a killer, but something far worse. Something that had made a pact with the hungry, ancient darkness of the land itself. The stories swirling around Elspeth Blackwood were just the beginning of a descent into a horrifying local legend. To uncover the forbidden history of Hemlock Hollow, make sure you subscribe, because the path to her cabin door is paved with secrets even the devil would be afraid to whisper. The fear was a poison, and it was spreading through the community's veins, turning suspicion into a certainty that lacked only a body of proof. Constable Thorne felt the shift. The town's fear was now his ally. He was no longer a lone voice crying in the wilderness. The entire hollow was now watching the widow, waiting, and Thorne knew that the next time someone vanished, he would not be told to let it go. Spring arrived, and with it, a thaw that revealed the land's grim secrets. As the snow melted, the body of another man was discovered by a farmer clearing a new field. This one was little more than a skeleton, picked clean by the elements and the animals. But clutched in its bony hand was a silver pocket watch, its casing engraved with the initials S.K. Sela's cane. The peddler had been found. His discovery, so close to the other bodies, solidified the horrifying geography of death that centered on the Blackwood land. The town's fear curdled into a quiet, simmering rage. This was no longer a matter of rumor or superstition. This was a graveyard. Armed with this new evidence, Constable Thorne felt emboldened. He began to dig deeper, not into the present, but into the past. He wondered about Elspeth's origins, the life she lived before she brought her shadows to the Ozarks. Using the information from the county archives, he sent a telegraph to the sheriff of the Appalachian County where the Blackwoods had last resided. The reply came a week later, a single cryptic message that made Thorne's blood run cold. It read, "Blackwood family departed abruptly after the winter of the empty POTS. Local whispers of unnatural survival. No official charges. Consider yourselves WARNED. The winter of the empty pots." The name itself was a folk tale, pregnant with grim meaning. Thorne could guess its outlines. A season of famine, of starvation, where families wasted away behind their cabin doors. Yet the Blackwoods had survived. More than survived, they had apparently thrived enough to pack up and move halfway across the country. Unnatural survival. The phrase echoed the disturbing vitality of Elspeth's garden, the constant smoke from her chimney. A horrifying theory began to form in Thorne's mind, a theory so monstrous, so contrary to the laws of God and man, that he could barely bring himself to consider it. What if the fever that claimed her family wasn't a disease? What if it was a symptom of a deeper, more disturbing affliction? What if the consumption that was recorded wasn't a sickness but an act, a horrifying act of survival that had become a way of life? To understand the darkness that festered in the Ozarks, one must understand the land's soul. This was not a place of gentle streams and rolling meadows. It was a place of deep folklore, a culture steeped in tales brought over from the old countries, from the Scottish Highlands, Ireland, and Germany. These were stories of curses that clung to bloodlines, of witches who could sour milk or steal the breath from a newborn child, and of creatures that lurked just beyond the firelight, their eyes glowing in the dark. In Hemlock Hollow, these were not just children's stories. They were a living part of the worldview, a way of explaining a world that was often cruel and capricious. A sudden crop failure wasn't bad luck, it was a hex. A sick child wasn't just ill, it was taken by a spirit. And a woman who survived when all around her perished, a woman whose garden grew with impossible life while her neighbors withered, was not merely fortunate. She was trafficking with forbidden powers. The whispers about Elspeth Blackwood began to merge with these older, more terrifying legends. She was no longer just a suspected poisoner. She was a wood witch, a rawhead and bloody bones in human form. Old Man Hemlock, the town's oldest resident, a man whose grandfather had been one of the first settlers, claimed the land the Blackwoods bought was cursed long before they arrived. He spoke of the native tribes who had shunned it, calling it the place of hungry ground, where the earth itself had a malevolent appetite. He said that anyone who lived on that land for too long would eventually be consumed by it, or worse, would become its servant, its collector of tithes paid in blood and bone. Constable Thorne had always dismissed these tales as the ramblings of a superstitious old man, but now he wasn't so sure. The message from Appalachia about unnatural survival suggested that Elspeth's story was not new. She had brought this darkness with her. Or perhaps she had been drawn to this particular piece of land for a reason, seeking a place whose soul was as dark as her own. The investigation was no longer just about missing men. It was about confronting a piece of living, breathing, macabre folklore. The winter of the empty pots. Constable Thorne couldn't shake the phrase. It conjured images of desperate, starving people, of skeletal families huddled together for warmth, waiting for an end that was already inevitable. Famine was not uncommon in these isolated mountain communities. A bad harvest, a severe winter, and a family could be cut off, left to its own devices with a dwindling food supply. The ultimate taboo, the most forbidden act in such desperate times, was the breaking of the covenant of community and family. To survive at the expense of one's own kin was a sin so profound it was rarely spoken of aloud. It was the stuff of the darkest, most disturbing legends. The story of the Donner Party had horrified the nation decades earlier, a cautionary tale of how civilization breaks down under the weight of starvation. But that was a group of strangers. The whispers about the Blackwoods implied something far more intimate, more horrifying, a perversion of the family unit itself. Thorne began to re-examine the deaths of Elspeth's husband and children. Consumption, a slow, wasting disease, but the rumors claimed they had perished in less than a week. That wasn't consumption. That was poison or a disease of unnatural speed and virulence, or it wasn't a disease at all. Thorne found himself picturing the scene, a remote cabin in the Appalachian winter, snow piling up outside, the larder bare, the faces of hungry children, the despair in a husband's eyes, and Elspeth, the sole survivor. What would it take for a person to do the unthinkable, to see their family not as loved ones but as sustenance? The idea was so monstrous it felt like a blasphemy, yet it fit the horrifying puzzle pieces together. The unnatural survival. The constant need for meat, evidenced by her smoking chimney. Her targeting of solitary men, strangers with no one to miss them, continuing a pattern of consumption she had begun long ago. She wasn't just a killer, she was a cannibal, a predator who had acquired a taste for forbidden flesh and had spent the rest of her life hunting to satisfy it. It was a cold case that stretched back years, its roots in a winter of horrifying desperation. Proof. Thorne needed proof. A monstrous theory, no matter how well it fit the facts, was not enough to act. He couldn't walk up to the mayor and accuse the widow Blackwood of being a cannibal who had devoured her own family years ago in Appalachia. They would lock him in a cell and throw away the key. He had to get inside that cabin again. More specifically, he had to get inside her smokehouse and her root cellar. He knew with a sick certainty that was where he would find the truth. But how? He couldn't get a warrant on suspicion alone. He would be committing a crime himself, breaking and entering. If he found nothing, his career, his reputation, and his freedom would be forfeit. For weeks, he wrestled with his conscience and his fear. He watched the Blackwood property from a distance, hiding in the dense woods, observing her routine. It was simple, methodical, and unchanging. She would tend her garden in the morning, mend her fences or chop wood in the afternoon, and retreat into her cabin before dusk. The smoke from her chimney was a constant, taunting presence. He saw no visitors. She was utterly alone, a queen in her small, macabre kingdom. The decision was made for him by the arrival of a new potential victim. A young man, a cartographer from St. Louis, came to town asking for directions. He was part of a team surveying for a new railroad line, and he was heading out alone to chart the very area that encompassed the Blackwood property. Thorne warned him, as strongly as he could without revealing his full suspicions. He told him the area was dangerous, that people had gone missing. The young man, full of the arrogant confidence of the city, just Ged, he was a man of science and progress, not a believer in backwoods superstitions. He patted the revolver on his hip and assured Thorne he could handle himself. As Thorne watched the young cartographer ride out of town, heading directly toward the widow's lair, he knew he was out of time. He could not stand by and let another man be harvested. That night, under the sliver of a cold, dead moon, Jebediah Thorne would break the law to uphold it. He would become a trespasser, a burglar, in the desperate hope of stopping a monster. The night was unnervingly quiet as Thorne made his approach. He left his horse tied up a mile away and moved through the woods like a ghost, his old army training serving him well. The moon offered little light, forcing him to rely on memory and instinct to navigate the treacherous terrain. The Blackwood cabin was a dark shape against the slightly less black sky, a single thread of smoke rising from the chimney, illuminated faintly by the stars. He watched it for what felt like an eternity, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. There were no lights in the windows, no sounds from within. She was asleep, or she was waiting. The thought sent a jolt of pure fear through him. He moved with agonizing slowness toward the smokehouse, a small, windowless outbuilding that stood a few yards from the main cabin. The heavy padlock he'd seen on his first visit was still there. He had come prepared. With a set of iron files and a tension wrench he had borrowed from the town blacksmith, he set to work. The scraping of metal on metal sounded deafening in the silence. Every nerve in his body was on fire, expecting at any moment to hear the cabin door creak open, to see her silhouette in the doorway, but nothing happened. After several tense minutes, the lock clicked open. He paused, listening. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines, a lonely, mournful sound. He pulled the heavy door open and the smell hit him first. It was the smell of cured meat, familiar to any countryman, but underneath it was another smell. A coppery, slightly sweet odor that was horribly, sickeningly familiar from his time on the battlefield. It was the smell of old blood. He struck a match, the small flame flaring to life, pushing back the oppressive darkness. And he saw them. Hanging from the rafters were not hams or sides of bacon. They were cuts of meat, yes, but the shapes were disturbingly wrong. And hanging on hooks along the back wall, neatly arranged, were items of clothing: a peddler's sturdy wool coat, a trapper's fur-lined hat, and a surveyor's leather satchel. The match burned his fingers and he dropped it, plunging himself back into darkness. But the horrifying image was seared onto the back of his eyelids. The smokehouse was not for preserving game. It was a larder. and Elspeth Blackwood's livestock walked on two legs. Thorne stumbled back from the smokehouse, his mind reeling, his stomach threatening to betray him. The smell, the sight, it was a confirmation so absolute and so horrifying that it felt unreal. For a moment he considered his duty done. He had the proof. He could ride back to town, deputize a dozen men, and return to arrest her. It was the sensible, lawful thing to do. But a darker thought took hold. This was not enough. He had found the bodies, but he had not found the root of the evil. The root, he felt with chilling certainty, was in the cellar from which that strange, sweet smell seemed to emanate. He had to know the full extent of her depravity. He had to see the heart of her operation. He crept to the main cabin, his revolver now drawn, the cold weight of it a small comfort in his trembling hand. He moved to the side of the house, to a small, shuttered window he had noted before. Using the tip of his knife, he carefully worked at the simple latch. It gave way with a soft click. He eased the shutter open an inch and peered inside. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint, demonic red light across the room. He could see the cot in the corner. It was empty. A jolt of panic seized him. She wasn't sleeping. Where was she? Then he saw it. The iron ring on the trapdoor was slick with a dim light. The cellar door was open, and from the dark square in the floor he could hear a sound, a soft, rhythmic sound like chopping. And a voice, a low, humming, tuneless melody. It was the sound of someone contentedly at work. He knew then that he could not wait for backup. He was the only thing standing between her and her next victim. Taking a deep breath, he moved to the front door, raised his boot, and kicked it in with all his strength. The door crashed open, splintering its frame, and Jebediah Thorne plunged into the heart of the nightmare. The scene that greeted Constable Thorne was a tableau from the deepest circle of hell. The room was just as he remembered, but now the source of the sweet, macabre smell was overwhelming. A large cast-iron pot simmered over the embers in the hearth, its contents hidden by a thick, greasy broth. On the large wooden table in the center of the room, where he had once seen a simple vase of wildflowers, now lay the freshly butchered remains of a human being. It was the young cartographer from St. Louis. Thorne recognized the man's fine city boots, tossed carelessly in a corner. And standing over the table, her back to the door, was Elspeth Blackwood. She held a large butcher's cleaver, its blade dark with blood. She was humming her tuneless, terrifyingly domestic melody as she worked, methodically separating muscle from bone with an expert's precision. The sound of the door crashing open made her pause. She did not scream. She did not startle. She simply placed the cleaver down on the table with a soft, metallic click and turned to face him. Her hands and apron were soaked in blood. Her face, illuminated by the dying fire, was a mask of utter serenity. Her dark eyes met his, and there was no madness in them. There was only a calm, profound, and ancient hunger. "You are interrupting my work, Constable," she said, her voice as even and unbothered as if he had caught her kneading bread. The sheer, sociopathic normalcy of her reaction was more terrifying than any monstrous snarl could have been. It was the calm of a creature that does not recognize the laws of man, a creature that sees a fellow human being as nothing more than raw material, a resource to be harvested. "Elspeth Blackwood," Thorne's voice shook, but he held his revolver steady, its barrel aimed at her heart. "You are under arrest for the crime of murder." Elspeth looked at the gun, then back at his face. A slow, thin smile spread across her lips, a smile of pity and amusement. "You use such small words, Constable," she whispered. "Murder, crime, they are for your world, not for mine." Thorne's mind struggled to process the scene. The domestic tranquility of the cabin was grotesquely overlaid with the butchery on the table. It was the banality of the evil that was so disorienting. This wasn't a frenzied act of passion. It was a chore, a routine as normal as canning peaches or mending a shirt. The horrifying truth settled upon him. For Elspeth Blackwood, this was survival. A twisted, monstrous form of it, but survival nonetheless. Why? The word escaped his lips, a desperate plea for a logic he could understand. Elspeth tilted her head, considering the question as if it were a genuine philosophical inquiry. Why does the wolf hunt the deer? Why does the spider trap the fly? The world is divided into two things, Constable, the eater and the eaten. It is the most fundamental law, All of your laws, your morals, your religions. They are just pretty stories men tell themselves to forget that one horrifying truth. She took a small step toward him, her movements fluid and unthreatening like a predator trying to soothe its prey. That first winter, back in the mountains, my Josiah was a good man, a strong man, but he was weak. He prayed to a God who let his children starve. He told them to be patient, that the Lord would provide. I learned then that the only God who answers is the one you serve yourself, the God of the belly. Her confession was delivered without a hint of remorse. It was a statement of fact, a personal theology forged in the crucible of starvation and honed over years of practice. She had not fallen into madness. She had, in her own mind, achieved a kind of horrifying clarity. She had stripped away all sentiment, all morality, and was living by the most primal, brutal rule of nature. Thorne's hand tightened on his revolver. "So you prey on the lost, the lonely." "I am a practical woman," she replied, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I take only what will not be missed. The world is full of lonely men, Constable. They drift through life like leaves on the wind, and when they are gone, no one hears them fall. I offer them a moment of warmth, a final purpose. They feed the hungry earth," she said, gesturing to the floorboards, "and they feed me. It is a neat and tidy circle." The trapdoor to the cellar lay open, a square of perfect blackness yawning in the floor. From it rose a chill and a smell that was older and deeper than the fresh horror on the table. It was the smell of earth, of rot, and of aged, preserved meat. "My pantry," Elspeth said, noticing his gaze. "A good homemaker is always prepared for the lean times." Thorne felt a morbid compulsion to see, to know the full, banned history of her crimes. Keeping his gun trained on her, he edged toward the opening. He lit a lantern that sat on a nearby crate, the one she must have been using, and held it down into the darkness. The light revealed a steep set of stone steps leading down into a small, earth-walled cellar. The sight below was one of systematic, organized horror. Shelves lined the walls, filled with large glass jars, but instead of fruits and tables, they contained preserved organs, neatly labeled in a precise, elegant script. On other shelves, salted and cured cuts of human meat were stacked like cordwood, and in a far corner there was a pile of bones, bleached and scrubbed clean, stacked with an almost artistic sense of order. This was not the work of a madwoman. This was the work of an artisan, a connoisseur of the macabre, but it was the other items that truly froze Thorne's blood. Hanging from pegs on the wall were more personal effects, a library of her victims, a dozen hats of different styles, a collection of belts, their buckles tarnished, and a row of boots, all sizes, all worn, their leather scuffed with the dust of roads that had led to this cellar. Each item was a silent testament to a life cut short, a man who had been reduced to a trophy and a cut of meat. Thorne felt a wave of vertigo. He was not just in a killer's lair. He was in a museum of horrors, a monument to a lifetime of predatory consumption. He was standing at the altar of her horrifying religion, and the offerings were the forgotten men of the road. He finally understood. She wasn't just feeding herself. She was preserving them, honoring them in her own twisted way. It was a horrifying intimacy, a final act of possession. As Thorne stared into the abyss of the cellar, his focus momentarily broken, Elspeth moved. She was not fast, but she was silent and purposeful. In one fluid motion, she grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the hearth, its bottom blackened with soot. He heard the scrape of metal on stone and turned just as she swung it. He fired his revolver, the shot deafening in the small cabin. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of her shoulder, spinning her partially around. But her momentum was too great. The heavy skillet crashed against the side of his head with a sickening thud. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain and then collapsed into darkness. He fell, his head hitting the floorboards with a crack. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Elspeth standing over him, her face impassive despite the blood now blooming on her black dress. Her eyes were not filled with rage or panic, but with a look of mild annoyance, as if he were a household pest that needed to be dealt with. He had kicked in her door, shot her, and uncovered her monstrous secret, and all he had earned was a look of inconvenience. The darkness that took him was absolute. When he awoke, it was to pain and a profound, disorienting silence. His head throbbed with a skull-splitting ache. He was lying on the floor of the cabin, his hands bound tightly behind his back with thick rope. The body of the cartographer was gone from the table. The blood had been wiped away. The cleaver was clean. The pot still simmered over the fire, but the smell was now just that of a simple, savory stew. The trapdoor to the cellar was closed. If not for the splintered doorframe and the pounding in his head, he could have convinced himself it had all been a horrifying dream. But then he saw her. Elspeth was sitting in a rocking chair by the fire, calmly stitching the bullet wound in her own shoulder with a needle and thread, just as she might mend a torn seam. She didn't even flinch as she pulled the thread tight. She had turned a gunshot wound into a minor domestic chore. She had tidied up the murder, and now she was tidying up herself. And Thorne knew, with a certainty that was colder than any winter night, that she was now deciding what to do with him. "You are a complication, Constable," Elspeth said, not looking up from her needlework. Her voice was calm, almost conversational. "I have always been so careful. I choose those who are already lost. No one to ask questions, no one to come looking but you. You have roots. People will notice your absence." Thorne tested his bonds. They were expertly tied, the knots impossibly tight. He was a prisoner, helpless. He had seen her secret, and he knew there was no possibility that she would let him live. The only question was how it would end. He decided to talk, to keep her engaged, to buy himself time he likely didn't have. "How many?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "How many men have ended up in your pantry?" She paused her stitching for a moment, her dark eyes looking at something far away. "I stopped counting long ago," she said. "Does the farmer count his wheat? Does the river count the stones it wears away? They are a harvest, a necessity, nothing more." "They were men," Thorne insisted, a useless appeal to humanity she had long since abandoned. "They had names, lives. They had appetites," she corrected him, "and weaknesses. They saw a lonely woman, a warm fire. They thought they were the predator and I the prey. It is the oldest story in the world, Constable, but in my house the story has a different ending." She finished her stitch and bit the thread with her teeth. The wound was crudely but effectively closed. S.H. He looked at him then, a speculative, appraising look. It was not the look of a killer sizing up her victim. It was the look of a cook assessing an ingredient. "You are tough," she said, almost to herself. "Sinewy, not ideal, but the winter will be long and one cannot be too particular." The horrifying implication was clear. He was not just her prisoner, he was her next meal. He was the meat she would cure for the coming winter. The sheer, pragmatic horror of her logic was a physical force, pressing the air from his lungs. He had to escape. He had to find a way. As Elspeth rose from her chair and began to sharpen a long, thin boning knife, Thorne's mind raced, fueled by adrenaline and terror. He scanned the room, desperately searching for a weapon, an opportunity, anything. His gaze fell upon the mantel, upon the collection of macabre trophies, the tarnished silver button, the cracked compass, and the well-worn pocket knife. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. "The knife," he rasped, his throat dry. "On the mantel, the one with the pearl handle." "Where did you get it?" Elspeth paused, her sharpening, a flicker of something, not sentiment but perhaps curiosity, in her eyes. "It belonged to a man who told stories," she said. "He passed through a few years ago. He thought a few tales and a charming smile would earn him a free meal and a warm bed. He was right in a way." "That knife," Thorne lied, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It was my father's. He lost it in a card game years ago to a traveling storyteller. I'd know it anywhere." It was a complete fabrication, a wild, desperate swing in the dark. But he described the small chip in the pearl, a detail he had noticed during his first visit, a detail only someone who had held it would know. He was trying to build a connection, to make himself a person in her eyes, not just meat. For the first time since he had crashed through her door, Elspeth's serene composure wavered. A look of confusion, of annoyance, crossed her face. The idea that one of her anonymous, untethered victims might have a history, a connection to the man tied up on her floor, was a disruption to her carefully ordered world. These were more than just murders. They were a ritual of erasure. And if you find these forgotten, macabre tales as compelling as we do, consider liking this video to help us unearth more of them. The truth that Sheriff Thorne was about to find, however, was worse than any legend he could have imagined. His lie had introduced a narrative she couldn't control. While she was distracted, processing this new, inconvenient information, Thorn was at work. Twisting his hands behind his back, he managed to hook his bound wrists around the leg of the heavy wooden table he was lying beside. He began to pull, using the table's weight as leverage, straining against the ropes with all his might. He needed one moment of distraction, one chance. "He was a liar then," Elspeth said, her voice regaining its cold composure as she dismissed his story. "He told me he had no family." She turned back to her knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone resuming, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The rhythm of her work was broken. Thorn gave a final, desperate heave. The rope bit into his wrists, but he felt a slight give. The table leg was rough, unfinished wood, and the friction was beginning to fray the fibers of the rope. He strained harder, the muscles in his back and shoulders screaming in protest. He could feel blood trickling down his hands, but he ignored the pain. He focused on the sound of the knife, the scrape, scrape, scrape that was the countdown to his own death and dismemberment. Suddenly, the rope snapped. His hands were free. In an instant, Thorn scrambled to his feet, grabbing the heavy wooden chair beside him and flinging it at her. Elspeth sidestepped the projectile with a surprising, animal grace. Chair crashed against the wall. She came at him then, not with a scream of rage, but with a silent, focused intensity. The boning knife flashed in the firelight. Thorn, still dizzy and weak from the blow to his head, stumbled backward. He grabbed the only thing he could reach, the heavy iron poker from the hearth, still warm from the embers. The fight was a desperate, clumsy, and brutal affair. It was not a duel of masters, but a primal struggle for survival in a blood-soaked cabin at the edge of the world. She was fast, the knife a blur, jabbing and slashing. He was stronger, using the poker to parry her attacks, the clang of iron on steel ringing through the room. She moved with a frightening economy of motion, her dark eyes fixed on him, searching for an opening. He was driven by pure, unreasoning terror. He swung the poker and it connected with her arm, drawing a pained hiss and forcing her to drop the knife. He didn't hesitate. He brought the poker down again, a heavy, final blow to her head. She collapsed to the floor without a sound, a heap of black cloth and blood. Thorn stood over her, panting, his body shaking, the iron poker clutched in his white-knuckled fist. The silence of the cabin rushed back in, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the soft, innocent crackle of the fire. For a long moment, Jebediah Thorn stood frozen, his mind unable to fully grasp what had happened. He had survived. He had stopped the monster. He slowly lowered the poker, his body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. He checked Elspeth. She was unconscious but still breathing, a faint, shallow rise and fall of her chest. He found his rope on the floor and with shaking hands bound her securely. Only then did he allow himself to fully assess the situation. He was injured, exhausted, and miles from town, but he was alive, and he had his prisoner. He knew he couldn't leave her here. He couldn't risk her waking, escaping. He had to take her back to Hemlock Hollow to expose her crimes to the light of day. He searched the cabin, finding a length of heavy chain in a storage box, which he used to further secure her. He then forced himself to descend into the cellar, the source of the forbidden knowledge. He had to see it again to confirm it was real, that he hadn't imagined the horrors in a delirium. The jars of preserved organs, the cured meat, the trophies, they were all there. It was a testament to decades of a secret, horrifying life. He took one of the jars as evidence, its contents grotesque and undeniable. He also retrieved the pocket knife from the mantel, the lie that had saved his life. Before leaving, he looked around the cabin one last time. It was a place of profound contradictions. A place of meticulous order and unspeakable chaos, of domestic tranquility and industrial-scale murder. It was a monument to a single, unyielding, and monstrous will. He dragged the unconscious Elspeth from the cabin, and with a strength born of desperation, managed to get her onto his horse. He tied her to the saddle, then began the long, slow walk back to civilization, leading the horse through the darkness. The woods that had seemed so menacing on his way in now felt different. The monster was no longer hiding in the shadows. He was leading it, bound and broken on the end of a rope. The return of Constable Thorne to Hemlock Hollow was a spectacle that would be burned into the town's memory for generations. He emerged from the woods at dawn, a grim, blood-stained figure, his head bandaged with a torn piece of his own shirt. Behind him, the horse carried the slumped, unconscious form of Elspeth Blackwood, tied to the saddle like a sack of grain. A crowd gathered quickly, their sleep-filled eyes widening with shock and a dawning, horrified understanding. Thorne didn't say a word. He simply led the horse to the front of his office, dismounted, and retrieved the glass jar from his saddlebag. He placed it on the hitching post for all to see. The townsfolk stared at the jar's grisly contents, and a collective gasp went through the crowd. The whispers, the rumors, the dark folklore, it was all true. The proof was right there, floating in a murky brine. The town's fear, which had been a simmering, atmospheric dread, now coalesced into a single, focused point of revulsion. They looked at the unconscious woman, no longer a mysterious widow but a demon in the flesh, the architect of the horrors that had plagued their community for years. Thorne, with the help of the blacksmith, placed Elspeth in the town's single holding cell. She was still unconscious, a silent, broken figure, but even in her sleep she seemed to exude an aura of menace. The men who helped carry her recoiled from her touch as if she were red-hot iron. As the sun rose higher, casting its clean morning light on the dusty street, the town of Hemlock Hollow had to reckon with a truth far more disturbing than any of their superstitions. The evil that lived in the hills was not a spirit or a curse. It was a woman who looked just like them but who was separated by a gulf of incomprehensible depravity. The horrifying cold case of the missing strangers was finally closed, or so they thought. The aftermath was a quiet, controlled storm of official procedure. A deputy and a judge arrived from the county seat, their faces grim as they listened to Thorne's account. They formed a posse of trusted men and rode out to the Blackwood property. What they found there confirmed every detail of Thorne's horrifying story. The smokehouse larder, the cellar of atrocities, the scattered remains buried in the unnaturally fertile garden. It was a scene of such profound, systematic evil that it defied belief. The men who documented the scene were hardened by life on the frontier, but they worked in silence, their faces pale and drawn. The sheer scale of Elspeth Blackwood's crimes was staggering. Based on the trophies and remains, they estimated she was responsible for the deaths of at least a dozen men, perhaps more. She was a serial kill. Operating for years with terrifying efficiency, using the isolation of the Ozarks as her shield and accomplice. But the authorities faced a problem. The truth was too monstrous. The story of a cannibalistic widow who fed on strangers and had possibly consumed her own family was not something they wanted to become public knowledge. This was an era of progress, of taming the frontier, of selling the promise of a safe and civilized life to settlers from the East. A story like this would not just stain the reputation of Hemlock Hollow, it would reinforce the darkest stereotypes of the region as a place of savage, godless people. It was a story that was banned before it could even be told. A decision was made, quietly, between the judge, the mayor, and Constable Thorne. The official records would be sealed. The details would be suppressed. The Blackwood property and all its contents were to be burned to the ground, erasing the physical evidence from the landscape. The official narrative would be simple. Elspeth Blackwood was a madwoman, a common murderer, responsible for the deaths of a few vagrants. The horrifying, macabre specifics, the cannibalism, the trophies, the cellar, would be buried, a forbidden history known only to a handful of men. While the men were sanitizing her legacy, Elspeth Blackwood finally awoke. She was in the small, dark cell, lying on a thin cot. When Thorne entered, she was sitting up, her posture as straight and composed as ever. The wound on her shoulder and the gash on her head did not seem to bother her. Her dark eyes, clear and intelligent, followed him as he approached the bars. She was not ranting or raving. She showed no signs of the madness they had decided to attribute to her. "You have spoiled a very well-ordered life, Constable," she said, her voice a low, even murmur. "All that hard work gone to waste." Thorne felt a chill despite the stuffy air of the cell. She spoke of her life's work of murder and cannibalism as one might speak of a ruined garden or a collapsed barn. The disconnect from any recognizable human emotion was absolute. "It's over, Elspeth," he said, his voice weary. "Over." She gave that same thin, pitying smile she had given him in her cabin. "Nothing is ever over, Constable. You think you have captured me. You have captured a body, a vessel. You cannot capture an idea, the hunger. The hunger is an idea. It is the oldest idea in the world, and it is always waiting." She leaned closer to the bars, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You have it too, you know, all of you. You just dress it up in pretty clothes and call it ambition or progress or love. But underneath it all, you are just hungry. I am simply more honest about it." Her words were insidious, a poison aimed at the very foundation of his worldview. She was attempting to drag him down into her horrifying philosophy, to make her depravity seem not like an aberration, but like an honest expression of a universal truth. Thorne refused to let her. He would not engage with her twisted logic. "You will be transferred to the state asylum at Fulton," he said, keeping his voice official, detached. "You will stand trial and you will answer for what you have done." Elspeth Blackwood simply leaned back, her smile widening slightly. "We shall see," she whispered. "The world is a very large and very hungry place." The day Elspeth Blackwood was transported from Hemlock Hollow, a strange, oppressive silence fell over the town. The people watched from their windows as she was loaded into a caged prison wagon, a special transport sent from the county seat. She was chained, but she walked with an unnerving dignity, her head held high. She did not look at the faces in the windows. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, as if she were merely embarking on a journey. As the wagon pulled away, a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the town. The monster was gone. The curse was lifted. But the relief was short-lived, replaced by a lingering unease. Her presence had been like a cancer on the community, and its removal left a scar. The men who had been to her cabin, who had seen the full extent of her atrocities, were changed. They were quieter, their eyes holding a new, haunted look. They rarely spoke of what they had seen, but their silence was heavier than any words. The story of Elspeth Blackwood became a thing of whispers, a forbidden tale told by parents to frighten their children into behaving. The facts, already officially suppressed, began to blur and merge with the older folklore of the region. She became less a person and more a supernatural entity, a wood witch who could steal your soul, a creature that came in the night to drag you away. The Blackwood property, even after the cabin and all its outbuildings were burned to ash, remained a feared and shunned place. The land was sold for back taxes, but no one ever dared to build on it again. Locals claimed that nothing would grow there anymore, that the earth itself was poisoned by the blood it had soaked up. They said that on cold, clear nights, you could still see a faint light in the clearing where the cabin once stood, and hear a woman's low, tuneless humming on the wind. The evil had been removed, but its shadow remained, a permanent stain on the landscape and the collective memory of the people of Hemlock Hollow. Constable Jebediah Thorne was hailed as a hero. He had faced the monster and won. But he did not feel like a hero. He felt contaminated. Elspeth's words in the cell, her horrifying philosophy of the eater and the eaten, had burrowed into his mind like a parasite. He found himself looking at his neighbors, at the cheerful faces in the general store, and seeing behind their smiles a flicker of that same primal hunger she had described. He saw it in the merchant haggling over prices, in the farmer boasting of his land, in the young men fighting over a girl. Was she right? Was civilization just a thin, fragile veneer over a core of brutal, selfish appetite? He began to drink heavily, seeking to drown the whispers in his own mind. Sleep offered no escape, his dreams filled with images of the cellar, of the trophies, of her calm, dark eyes. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss was now a part of him. He became withdrawn and taciturn, the peace he had sought in Hemlock Hollow forever shattered. The community he had fought to protect now seemed to him a collection of strangers, each with their own secret, hidden hungers. He had done his duty, but it had cost him his soul. One morning, 6 months after Elspeth's transfer, a package arrived for him at the telegraph office. It had no return address, only a postmark from a town near the state asylum. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a single object, a tarnished silver button, the kind found on a gentleman's waistcoat, the button from her mantle. There was no note, none was needed. It was a message, a reminder, a horrifying promise. It meant that even from within the walls of the asylum her influence could still reach out. Or it meant something far, far worse. It meant that she was no longer in the asylum at all. The cold case he thought he had closed had just been pried open once more, and this time it felt personal. Thorne immediately sent a telegraph to the asylum at Fulton, his hands shaking as he tapped out the message. He demanded to know the status of prisoner 734, Elspeth Blackwood. The reply was slow to come, delayed by bureaucracy and indifference. For 3 days, Thorne existed in a state of heightened paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every gust of wind sounded like her whisper. He kept his revolver loaded and close at hand, sleeping in his chair by the door of his office. He felt like he was being hunted, the roles of predator and prey now chillingly reversed. Finally, the response arrived. The telegraph operator read it aloud, his voice flat and unconcerned. Prisoner 734 E. Blackwood, deceased, died of consumption 2 months prior. Body interred in asylum cemetery. Matter closed. Matter closed. The official story was neat and tidy, just as her crimes had been suppressed. She had died of the same disease she had used as a cover for the murder of her family, a final, grim irony. For a moment, Thorne felt a wave of relief. The button must have been a cruel prank sent by someone who knew the story. It had to be. But the relief quickly evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping doubt. It was too neat, too convenient. Elspeth Blackwood was not a woman who would simply waste away and die of a common disease. She was a survivor, a creature of formidable will. And she had a history of faking deaths. Thorne thought of the message from Appalachia, departed abruptly. He thought of the uninspected coffins of her family. She was an expert at creating the illusion of an ending, at using paperwork and official indifference to cover her tracks. What if she had done it again? What if she had bribed a guard, faked her death, and simply walked out the gates? The asylum was a place of chaos and neglect, a dumping ground for society's unwanted. A clever, resourceful woman could easily get lost in the system or find a way to slip through its cracks. The button was not a prank. It was a declaration, a statement that she was free, and she knew where he was. Jebediah Thorne was now a man trapped in his own personal ghost story. He had a choice. He could accept the official story that Elspeth was dead and the button was a coincidence and try to live with the ghosts in his mind. Or he could accept the terrifying alternative, that she was alive, free, and toying with him from the shadows. To do so would be to accept a life of constant fear, of looking over his shoulder for the rest of his days. It would be to admit that he had not won, that he had merely survived one encounter with an evil that was now untethered, roaming the world at will. He left Hemlock Hollow. Month later, he told the mayor that his work there was done, that he needed to move on. He didn't tell them he was fleeing, that he was a man haunted by a ghost who might not be a ghost at all. He drifted west, taking odd jobs, never staying in one place for too long. He became one of the lonely, forgotten men he had once tried to protect. He was a man with no roots, a man who would not be missed if he were to suddenly vanish. In a way, Elspeth had won. She had not killed his body, but she had consumed his life, turning him into a mirror of her own chosen victims. Years passed. The story of the cannibal widow of the Ozarks faded completely from public record, becoming a truly forbidden history, a macabre legend whispered only by the oldest residents of a forgotten town. The truth of what happened in that cabin, the full extent of the horror, was buried forever. But for Thorne, the cold case was never closed. Every few years, a small package would find him, no matter where he was, no matter what name he was using. A brass compass with cracked glass, a small carved bone needle case, trinkets from her collection, trophies from men long dead. Each one was a message, a quiet, chilling reminder that she was still out there, still hunting, and that she had never forgotten the constable who had interrupted her work. The ultimate fate of Elspeth Blackwood remains one of the most disturbing and unresolved mysteries in the annals of American crime. Did she truly die of consumption in the Fulton State Hospital, her body buried in an unmarked grave in a potter's field? Or did she orchestrate a final, masterful disappearance, leaving a procured corpse in her place while she slipped away into the anonymity of a growing nation? There is no definitive answer. The asylum's records from that era are notoriously incomplete, and a fire in the early 20th century destroyed many of them, leaving a convenient gap in the historical record. This lack of certainty is, perhaps, the most unsettling part of her legacy. It allows her to transcend the facts of her case and become something more. She is a ghost in the machine of history, a question mark written in blood. Those who believe she died see her as a tragic, if monstrous, figure, a victim of circumstance who was pushed into depravity by starvation and isolation, her humanity consumed by a primal need to survive. In this version, her story is a cautionary tale about the thinness of civilization, a dark stain on the optimistic narrative of westward expansion. It is a story with a neat, if horrifying, ending. But those who believe she escaped see something far more terrifying. They see a predator who was not a victim, but a willing convert to a religion of consumption. A woman who was not broken by the world, but who simply saw it more clearly in its most brutal and fundamental terms. In this version, she is not a historical artifact. She is an ongoing threat, a timeless entity that could have changed her name, moved to a new town, and continued her harvest, adapting her methods to a changing world. A quiet landlady in a boarding house, a kindly nurse in a lonely hospital ward, a solitary woman at the edge of any town, with a warm fire and a welcoming smile for any stranger who happened to pass by. The land where her cabin once stood remains empty to this day. The forest has reclaimed the clearing, but the local stories persist. They say the ground is sour, that deer will not graze there, that birds will not sing in the trees that now grow where her garden once flourished with such unnatural life. It is a cursed place, a permanent monument to the horrifying events that transpired there. The tale serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface of the mundane, in the isolated and forgotten corners of the world. It is a story about how secrets, like bodies, can be buried, but they can also poison the ground for generations. The cold case of the widow who fed on strangers is not just about a single, monstrous woman. It is about the nature of evil itself. Was Elspeth Blackwood born a monster, or was she created by the desperate, brutal circumstances of her time? Was her cannibalism a result of madness, or was it a terrifyingly rational choice in a world that she saw as fundamentally divided into the eater and the eaten? The questions are as disturbing as her crimes, because they force us to look at the uncomfortable truths about our own capacity for darkness. Her story forces us to confront the idea that the lines we draw between civilization and savagery, between morality and survival, are perhaps more fragile than we would like to believe. We build our societies, our laws, and our beliefs as a fortress against the wilderness, both outside and within. But Elspeth Blackwood's story whispers a horrifying, forbidden truth from the past, that sometimes the wilderness wins, and sometimes it simply walks in through the front door, offers you a seat by the fire, and asks you to stay for dinner. Jebediah Thorne died in 1922, an old and broken man in a San Francisco flophouse. The official cause of death was cirrhosis of the liver, but the men who found his body said he looked like a man who had been scared to death. In his room, they found a small, locked wooden box. Inside was not money or valuables, but a collection of strange, seemingly random objects: a tarnished silver button, a cracked brass compass, a bone needle case, and a single yellowed piece of paper on which was written a list of dates and locations, a chronology of every time a package had found him over the years. It was a map of his haunting, a private record of his own personal cold case. The final entry was dated just 1 week before his death. It simply said, San Francisco. The implication was clear. After decades of toying with him from a distance, she had finally come for him. Or perhaps his own tortured mind, worn down by years of fear and alcohol, had simply given up, conjuring one final phantom to usher him into the darkness. We will never know for sure. The story of Elspeth Blackwood exists in this permanent state of macabre ambiguity. She is both a historical figure and a folkloric specter, a documented serial killer and a supernatural boogeyman. Her crimes were horrifyingly real, but her ultimate fate, and the true nature of her evil, remain shrouded in the mists of time and rumor. She is a perfect, self-contained American horror story, a testament to the fact that the darkest and most forbidden territories are not always on a map. Sometimes, they exist within the human heart in a lonely cabin deep in the hills, where the chimney is always smoking, and a strange, sweet, and horrifying aroma hangs heavy in the air. In the end, what makes the cold case of the Ozark widow so profoundly disturbing is not just the cannibalism or the body count. It is the chilling, unanswered questions she left behind. The most terrifying monsters are not the ones that roar and snarl. They are the ones that whisper, the ones that make a horrifying kind of sense. Elspeth Blackwood's philosophy of the eater and the eaten is a mirror held up to the darkest parts of human nature. Her actions were monstrous, but her logic in its most brutal form is difficult to entirely dismiss. Is the world not a place of consumption? Does survival not often come at the cost of another? Her life is a horrifying exploration of that single, forbidden idea, taken to its most extreme and literal conclusion. The story remains unresolved, and perhaps it is meant to be. It has become a part of the very landscape it emerged from, wild, mysterious, and dangerous. It serves as a permanent warning that echoes down through the years. Do not stray from the path. Do not trust a light in the darkness. And be wary of any shelter offered by a stranger, for you do not know what kind of hunger resides behind their door. The official records may be sealed, the cabin may be ash, and the players may be long dead, but the horrifying tale of the widow who fed on strangers lingers, a testament to a cold case that was never truly solved, and a darkness that was never truly vanquished. It is still out there, in the deep, dark woods of our history, waiting for the next lonely traveler to lose their way.